The sister who stole my husband 3 years ago finally came back for a family visit, smiled, and asked, "Still single?" Lol, while my ex laughed, "Hey, ugly, still the same?" Then my dad stood up and said, "Good timing. I have something important to tell you." And their expressions changed immediately. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of ordinary weekday where nothing is supposed to happen. I was standing in my kitchen with a cutting board half full of vegetables when my mom's name lit up my phone, and something in my stomach dropped before I even answered. 3 years of silence from my sister had trained that instinct into me whether I wanted it or not. "Emily, honey," my mom said, her voice carrying that careful, padded quality she used when she already knew I wouldn't like what came next. "Vanessa called your father today." I set the knife down. I remember that specifically, the small clack of metal against the cutting board, because it felt like the last normal sound I was going to hear for a while. "Okay," I said, because I didn't trust myself to say more than that. "She and Mark are back in town. She said she wants to come to Sunday dinner. Catch up, be a family again." That's how she put it. My mom paused, searching for a tone that wouldn't set me off, but also wouldn't lie to me. "Your father already said yes." I stood there in my kitchen for a long moment, vegetables forgotten, and felt the entire architecture of the last 3 years shift under my feet. Be a family again. As if we'd simply misplaced each other for a while, the way you misplace a set of keys, and now here we were, ready to be found. 3 years ago, I was married to a man named Mark, and I loved him with the kind of uncomplicated trust you only get to have once before life teaches you better. We'd been together 6 years, married 4, building the sort of life you don't think to question because it looks exactly like the life you were told to want. I thought I knew the shape of my own life so completely that I never once considered it might be built on something rotten. My younger sister, Vanessa, was 2 years behind me in everything that mattered and always had been. Always the prettier one according to relatives who thought they were being kind. Always the one who got away with things because she cried faster and louder than I ever could. I learned early to be the reliable one, the one who didn't need extra attention. It took me most of my 20s to understand that being the reliable one isn't a compliment. It's a role you get assigned because it's convenient for everyone except you. I came home early from a work trip on a Thursday in October, 3 years ago now, carrying a bag of takeout because I wanted something that tasted like my own kitchen instead of another airport terminal. I remember thinking, with something close to contentment, that this was exactly the kind of quiet evening I needed. The house was too quiet when I walked in. Not empty quiet, but wrong quiet. The kind where you can feel something happening before you have evidence of it. I set the bag on the counter and called out for Mark, and when nobody answered, I told myself he was out back. Some mundane explanation that would make the feeling in my chest go away. I walked upstairs instead. Some instinct pulled me toward our bedroom. Some part of me that already knew and was walking myself toward confirmation before my conscious mind had caught up. The bedroom door was half open, and what I saw inside is the kind of image that doesn't fade the way memories are supposed to. It sharpens instead. 3 years later, I could still draw you the exact position of the furniture, the exact color of the light through the blinds, the exact expression on both of their faces when they realized I was standing there. There were no gasps, no scrambling for cover. That's the detail that still sits wrong in my stomach even now, the utter absence of shame in either of their faces. They looked at me with something closer to inconvenience than guilt, as if I'd interrupted a meeting rather than discovered the collapse of everything I thought was solid in my life. "Emily," Mark said, his tone flat and almost bored, like he was addressing a minor scheduling conflict. "This isn't what it looks like." It was, of course, exactly what it looked like. Nobody ever says that sentence when the truth is actually more complicated than the obvious explanation. I don't remember leaving the house that night. I've been told I drove myself to my parents' house and sat in their driveway for 40 minutes before I could bring myself to go inside. I remember my father opening the front door before I'd even reached it, and I remember collapsing into him in a way I hadn't done since I was a child. What followed was a kind of efficient cruelty I hadn't known either of them was capable of. Mark filed for divorce within 48 hours. He cleared out a significant portion of our joint savings before the paperwork was even finalized. Money we'd built together over years of careful budgeting, gone into an account I no longer had access to. He didn't ask, he didn't negotiate. He simply took it. The way you take something you've already decided belongs entirely to you. Everyone expected me to fall apart, and for a while, I obliged them. I moved back into my parents' house that same week, into the same bedroom I'd grown up in, with faded paint and the outline of posters I'd taken down a decade earlier still faintly visible. I barely spoke for the first month. I ate when my mother put food in front of me and slept in stretches that felt more like unconsciousness than rest. My father, never a man of many words, would sit with me some evenings without saying anything at all, just present, in a way that helped more than any of the well-meaning speeches other people kept offering. What none of them knew was that somewhere underneath the collapse, something else had started forming. It didn't feel like determination at the time. It felt like rage that had nowhere else to go, so it went into work instead. I had a business degree I'd never fully used, shelved in favor of a marketing job that paid the bills but never asked much of me. In the wreckage of that October, I started reading dense material about business structures, holding companies, the mechanics of how family wealth typically got protected or lost, depending on who understood the rules. My father had built a modest but genuinely successful company over 30 years, Carter Enterprises, grown slowly and carefully from a single commercial property into something with real weight behind it. I had grown up adjacent to that success without ever really understanding it. I knew there was money. I didn't know how it worked. I started asking my father questions, small ones at first, about how the company was structured, about the difference between owning an asset outright and controlling it through layers of legal ownership. He answered patiently, but I noticed something shift about a month into this new habit of mine. He started leaving books on the kitchen table that I hadn't asked for, certain chapters bookmarked, as if testing whether I'd actually read them. I read every single one. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I asked if I could sit in on one of his quarterly meetings with Carter Enterprises senior staff. He didn't ask why. I sat in the back and said nothing, but I took notes on everything. The way decisions got made, the particular language people used when they talked about protecting a business from bad actors, family or otherwise. A year after the divorce, I asked him something bigger, to help me set up a small holding company of my own, funded with the modest settlement I'd received and savings I'd quietly rebuilt since moving out of shock and into motion. "What's it for?" he asked, not unkindly. "I don't know yet," I told him. "I just know I never want to be blindsided like that again." He helped me set it up within the month. We called it, at his suggestion, Ashcroft Holdings. Deliberately boring, deliberately forgettable. My father has always understood that the version of power that matters most is rarely the loud kind. It's the version nobody notices until it's already made its decision. For the first year, Ashcroft did almost nothing. I put small capital into low-risk investments, learned due diligence by doing it badly and then doing it better, made small mistakes while the stakes were still low. My father never stepped in to fix them for me. He asked questions afterward instead, the kind that made me find my own errors, which turned out to be a far better education than correction ever would have been. By the second year, I understood how this world actually worked, the world my father had operated in quietly for 3 decades while I was too consumed with my own life to notice its mechanics. I started looking at distressed debt, buying notes on struggling businesses at a discount, sometimes as investment, sometimes as leverage for situations that required patience. I found it suited my temperament. There is something almost meditative about reading a company's financials and understanding exactly where its vulnerabilities live. I never set out with a specific target. It would be tidier to say I spent 3 years building a trap with my ex-husband's name already on it, but that isn't what happened. I built competence. I built capital. I built a functioning business that had nothing to do with revenge, because revenge doesn't sustain itself over 3 years. What sustains itself is simply becoming someone new, someone who no longer needs anyone's permission to be secure. I kept loose tabs on both of them, not obsessively, but small towns have a way of keeping information circulating whether you seek it or not. I heard they'd moved out of state together within 6 months of the divorce, a fresh start, according to a mutual friend who mentioned it to my mother at a grocery checkout line. I heard later that Mark had left his corporate job to start something of his own, some kind of consulting venture. The details vague the way most secondhand gossip is. I didn't think much about it at the time. My life had genuinely moved past needing to think about either of them daily, which is its own quiet kind of victory. The kind that's really just waking up one day and realizing you went an entire week without them occupying your thoughts. 2 years and 8 months after the divorce, my father officially stepped down as CEO of Carter Enterprises. He didn't hand it to a board. He didn't sell it. He restructured it, quietly and legally, transferring controlling ownership to me. Every commercial property, every patent 30 years of careful work had built, became mine on paper months before that Sunday dinner ever appeared on anyone's calendar. I hadn't told Vanessa. I hadn't told Mark, obviously. I hadn't told most of my extended family either, because my father and I had agreed, without ever really discussing it directly, that this wasn't information that needed announcing. It simply needed to be true. I was, by the time my mother called on that Tuesday afternoon, the sole CEO and majority owner of a holding structure that included Carter Enterprises and my own quieter operation at Ashcroft. I owned the house my parents lived in, having quietly taken over the deed months earlier as part of an estate planning conversation with far more practical tax benefits than anyone else in the family understood or needed to. I had built, out of the wreckage of one October evening, something I genuinely hadn't been sure I was capable of building, and none of them knew any of it. "You're staying," my father had said 3 days before that Sunday, when I told him I was thinking about booking a hotel room for the weekend instead. We were in his study, the one room that still smelled faintly of the pipe tobacco he'd given up years ago, but never quite aired out of the upholstery. He wasn't looking at me when he said it, the same unbothered posture he used for every decision that actually mattered to him. "I don't see the point," I told him. "I don't need to sit at a table and pretend 3 years didn't happen. Nobody's asking you to pretend anything." He set his papers down and finally looked at me, and there was something in his expression I hadn't seen directed at me before. Not exactly pride, something quieter and more deliberate. "You've hidden long enough, Emily. Not from them, from yourself. It's time they see exactly who you actually became, and it's time you let them see it too." I didn't argue with him after that, though I wanted to. Some part of me still expected that staying meant walking back into the same room where I used to shrink automatically the second Vanessa entered it. I told myself I could handle one dinner. I told myself a lot of things that week that turned out to be smaller versions of a much bigger truth I hadn't fully arrived at yet. Sunday came the way Sundays do, slower than you want when you're dreading something, faster than you're ready for once it arrives. I spent the afternoon helping my mother in the kitchen, and I noticed my hands were steady in a way that surprised me. 3 years earlier, I couldn't have held a knife without my fingers trembling at the mere mention of my sister's name. Now I stood at my parents' counter, methodical and calm, and some small part of me registered that calm as evidence of something, though I couldn't yet articulate what. My father moved through the house that afternoon with an unusual quietness, the kind that in retrospect I recognize as a man running through a plan one final time before executing it. My mother, oblivious to whatever calculation was happening behind his calm exterior, fussed over table settings and asked twice whether the blue tablecloth or the cream one looked looked more welcoming, as though the color of a tablecloth could soften whatever was about to happen in that dining room. I was standing in the kitchen doorway, a serving spoon in my hand, checking on a dish in the oven, when I heard the car pull into the driveway. It wasn't a sound I recognized, the low, expensive hum of an engine that cost significantly more than the one I'd been driving through my 20s. I glanced out the window and saw a sleek black sedan settling in beside my father's much older, much more modest car, and something in my chest tightened involuntarily. An old reflex I thought I'd outgrown. I heard the front door open before I heard their voices, and I heard their voices before I saw their faces. And even that brief delay was enough to make my stomach drop the way it used to whenever Vanessa was about to walk into a room and rearrange the air in it. God, this place hasn't changed at all, I heard my sister say, her voice carrying that same bright, performative confidence I remembered, the tone she used when she wanted everyone in earshot to understand she'd moved on to bigger things. Kind of charming, honestly, like a time capsule. I heard Mark laugh at something, low and easy, the specific cadence of it landing on me with an unpleasant familiarity, like hearing a song you used to love playing somewhere you didn't expect it. I set the spoon down, wiped my hands on the dish towel, and walked into the front hallway to meet them, because hiding in the kitchen for the entire evening was never actually an option I was willing to consider. They stood in my parents' foyer like people inspecting a property they were considering buying. Vanessa wore a coat I recognized instantly as expensive, the kind of understated luxury that costs more precisely because it doesn't announce itself, and a watch that caught the hallway light every time she moved her hand. Mark stood slightly behind her, hands in the pockets of tailored trousers, glancing around with an expression that struck me as almost proprietary, as if reacquainting himself with a house he half expected to inherit some claim to. Neither of them offered a hug. Vanessa's eyes found me first, and she did the thing she'd always done, the slow, deliberate once-over that used to make me feel, at 8 years old and at 28, roughly 6 inches shorter than I actually was. Still single, lol, she said, and she actually laughed after saying it, a short, sharp sound that landed in the quiet hallway like something breaking. I didn't answer right away. Some part of me was still catching up to the reality that this was actually happening, that 3 years of careful distance had just been collapsed by 4 casual, cutting words delivered like an afterthought. Mark didn't wait for me to recover before adding his own. Hey, ugly, still the same? He said it grinning, the specific grin I remembered from arguments we used to have, the one that meant he thought he'd landed something clever and expected me to simply absorb it the way I always used to. I felt my mother go rigid somewhere behind me, though I didn't turn to look at her. I felt the specific silence of my father, who had come to stand near the dining room entrance, watching the exchange with an expression I couldn't quite read, something that wasn't anger exactly, something more patient and more dangerous than anger. I didn't cry. I didn't snap back with something equally sharp, though 3 years earlier, I might have tried and failed to land a comeback that would have only made things worse. I simply stood there, the dish towel still in one hand, and let the silence stretch, because I understood something in that moment that I don't think either of them understood yet. They had just spent their opening move on an insult, and I hadn't needed to spend anything at all. Dinner's almost ready, I said instead, my voice steadier than I expected. Come sit down. Twice we sat down at the same dining table my family had used for every major holiday and every awkward family conversation for as long as I could remember. The long oak one my father had refinished himself one summer when I was still a teenager. My mother had said it beautifully, the good china that only came out for occasions she considered worthy of it. Vanessa took her seat like she was settling into something that belonged to her. Mark sat beside her, glancing occasionally at his phone under the table in a way he clearly thought was subtle, the same low-level restlessness he'd had throughout our entire marriage. For the first few minutes, conversation stayed on the safe, forgettable surface families default to. My mother asked about the drive. Vanessa answered in her usual animated way, turning even a question about traffic into an opportunity to mention the luxury brand of the car they'd rented, like it was incidental information rather than the entire point. We actually looked at buying something similar, she said, glancing at Mark. Once the new venture really takes off. Right now it's more strategic reinvestment, building the foundation before you enjoy the fruits. It didn't take long for her to steer somewhere more pointed. She'd always had a talent for making a probing question sound like idle curiosity. So this house, she said, glancing around the dining room, you guys have kept it up so nicely. Property values around here have gone up so much. I heard houses on this street are going for almost double what they were. We're not selling the house, Vanessa, my mother said, a little too quickly. Oh, I know, I just meant eventually. Vanessa waved a hand, but her eyes stayed on my father a beat longer than the gesture suggested, waiting for a confirmation that never came. My father simply refilled his wine glass, unhurried, and changed the subject to the weather. A redirection so smooth I almost missed how deliberately he'd avoided giving her anything to work with. He let people talk themselves into revealing exactly what they wanted, then declined to hand it to them. Mark spent most of the early conversation trying to project effortless success that didn't quite land, mentioning his consulting venture twice in vague, impressive-sounding language that never specified what the company did or how it was performing. Building something from the ground up, just like Vanessa's family had, he added, glancing at my father, as if 3 decades of careful work could be casually equated with whatever he'd been doing for 2 years. My father accepted the comparison with a mild, non-committal nod that gave him nothing to build on. I mostly stayed quiet, not because I had nothing to say, but because I didn't need to. 3 years earlier, I would have felt compelled to counter every subtle dig. Now I simply ate my dinner and watched. My mother, meanwhile, refilled water glasses that didn't need refilling. The particular anxious hospitality of someone trying to smooth over a tension she could feel but couldn't name. This is really really nice, Vanessa said at one point. I've missed this. We should really do this more often, don't you think? Nobody answered her directly. My father simply reached for the serving dish, patient in a way I was beginning to understand had very little to do with patience and everything to do with waiting for exactly the right moment. It was somewhere around the middle of the meal that the evening took an unexpected turn, one that caught me more off guard than either of their earlier insults had. Vanessa set down her fork, dabbed at the corner of her mouth with her napkin, and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen her direct at me in years, something almost soft, almost sincere. I'm really glad we're doing this, she said. I mean it. I know things have been strange between us, and I know I haven't exactly made it easy to come back from that, but I've had a lot of time to think, and I just think life's too short, you know? Water under the bridge. I want us to actually be sisters again. For a moment, I just sat there, caught off guard. Some part of me, the part that had spent 3 years building distance as carefully as I'd built everything else, wanted to reject the sentiment outright, wanted to point out how strange it was to ask for forgiveness over pot roast after years of complete silence. But another part of me, quieter and more tired than I expected, felt something loosen slightly in my chest at the idea that maybe this really could be simple. Maybe people really did change. Maybe 3 years was enough time for even the deepest wounds to soften into something survivable. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand, and for one strange, disorienting second, the whole evening seemed to shift into something almost normal. My mother's shoulders visibly relaxed. Even my father's expression, usually so carefully neutral, seemed to ease slightly, as if he too were considering the possibility that this dinner might simply end in reconciliation, rather than whatever tension had been building underneath it all evening. We should have done this ages ago, Vanessa continued, and beside her, Mark nodded along with what looked like genuine agreement, playing the part of a man who had grown, who had learned something in the years since I'd last seen him look me in the eye. I know I wasn't exactly, gracious when we first got here, he said, and there was something almost convincing in the way he said it, a practiced humility that might have worked on someone who hadn't spent 3 years learning to read exactly this kind of performance. That was out of line. I'm sorry. He didn't specify what he was apologizing for exactly, and I noticed that, the careful vagueness of it, the way both of their apologies gestured at wrongdoing without ever quite naming it. But in the moment, sitting at that table with my sister's hand still resting warmly on mine, it was easier to let the vagueness slide than to demand the kind of precise accounting that would have reopened everything. For a few minutes, the conversation actually felt easy. Vanessa asked about my job, and I found myself giving a deliberately modest answer, mentioning some consulting work without elaborating, and she nodded along without pressing further, seemingly satisfied. Mark asked my father a few questions about the company, softer this time, less performative than his earlier attempts to establish himself as a fellow entrepreneur, and my father answered with the same easy, non-committal warmth he'd been offering all evening. I watched my sister's shoulders drop further, watched the tension visibly leave her posture, watched Mark relax into his chair in a way that suggested he genuinely believed the hardest part of the evening was behind him. I understood, watching them both settle into this fragile new peace, that they believed they had successfully navigated the awkward reintroduction, and were now simply coasting toward a pleasant, forgettable end to the night. I should have felt something more complicated in that moment, watching them relax into an ease I wasn't entirely sure either of them had earned. Instead, I felt strangely calm, the same calm I'd been carrying since they first walked through the door, and some part of me understood, even then, that we hadn't actually arrived anywhere yet. That whatever peace had settled over that table was temporary, not because I intended to disrupt it, but because my father hadn't said what he'd come here to say. He hadn't forgotten. I could see it in the particular way he was watching the two of them relax, patient and unhurried, waiting. This has been really nice, my mother said softly, refilling Vanessa's wine glass, her voice carrying the specific relief of a woman who had spent the entire evening bracing for a conflict that seemed, for the moment, to have quietly resolved itself. I glanced at my father. He hadn't touched his own wine glass in several minutes. He was simply sitting there, hands folded on the table in front of him, watching the pleasant, easy conversation continue around him with an expression I finally recognized, now that I knew him well enough in this new way to read it correctly. He was waiting for the right moment, and the right moment, I understood with a small, cold certainty settling back into my chest, hadn't arrived yet at all. My father set his fork down slowly, the small sound of metal against china cutting through the pleasant murmur of conversation, and something in the room shifted instantly, the way it always did when he decided it was time to speak. Everyone quieted automatically, a habit so old none of us had ever really examined it, the particular authority he carried simply by being unhurried in a room full of people who weren't. He pushed his chair back and stood, and I felt my own posture straighten involuntarily, some old childhood reflex telling me this was a moment worth paying full attention to. Good timing, he said, looking between Vanessa and Mark with an expression that gave away nothing at all. I have something important to tell you. Vanessa's face lit up almost instantly, and I watched the specific shape of her hope arrange itself across her features, plain enough that I didn't need to guess what she was thinking. I'd seen that look on her before, at every family gathering where money or property came up even tangentially, the barely concealed calculation of someone measuring exactly how much of something might eventually belong to her. Dad, she said, setting her own napkin aside, leaning forward slightly. Is this about the estate stuff? I know you and Mom have been talking about updating things. My father didn't answer immediately, and the silence stretched just long enough for Vanessa to fill it with her own assumptions. The way way people always do when someone important stays quiet a beat too long. Because I just want you to know, she continued, glancing briefly at Mark before continuing. Whatever you decide, I completely understand. I haven't always shown up the way I should have, but I hope you know how much it would mean to actually be considered, fairly, whatever that looks like. I watched my father's expression carefully. The small, almost imperceptible things I'd learned to read in him over 3 years of sitting across conference tables from men far less patient than he was. There was no anger in his face. There was something closer to a kind of controlled amusement, the specific look of a man watching someone walk confidently toward a door that wasn't going to open the way they expected. This isn't about the estate, he said, and I watched Vanessa's hopeful expression falter slightly, recalibrating. Oh, she said, and there was a small, awkward pause before she recovered her composure. Well, whatever it is, I'm sure it's exciting. My father reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and withdrew a slim folder I hadn't noticed him carrying earlier in the evening. The kind of unremarkable manila folder that could have contained anything. Tax documents, meeting notes, nothing at all. He set it on the table in front of him without opening it, his hand resting on top of it for a moment as though weighing exactly how to begin. 3 years ago, he said, and his voice had shifted into something I recognized instantly from watching him in business settings, measured and deliberate, every word laced with intention. This family went through something none of us talk about very often. I think that's been a mistake, honestly. I think silence let certain people believe the consequences of what happened simply evaporated because nobody said anything about them out loud. The easy warmth that had settled over the table minutes earlier evaporated instantly. I saw Mark's hand still on his wine glass. I saw Vanessa's earlier softness harden back into something more guarded, more alert. Dad, Vanessa said carefully, I thought we were past all that. We are past quite a lot of things, my father said, but being past something and pretending it never happened aren't the same thing, and I think it's time this family stopped confusing the two. He opened the folder then, slowly, and I watched both of their faces as he did. Watched the particular way people's expressions change when they sense, correctly, that the ground beneath them is no longer as stable as they assumed it was. I gave up the corner office a while back, he continued. I imagine you've heard that much, Vanessa, even if we haven't discussed the details directly. I might have heard something, she said carefully, her eyes licking toward the folder. What you may not have heard, my father said, is who I handed the company to. Vanessa's expression shifted again, and this time I could see the specific hope resurfacing underneath her caution, some old, familiar assumption reasserting itself despite everything happening around her. Family businesses passed to children. She was a child of this family. The math in her mind must have felt obvious. There was no board meeting, no sale. My father's voice stayed level. I restructured the entire company myself and put controlling ownership in your sister's name. The silence that followed lasted long enough that I could hear the refrigerator humming faintly from the kitchen, an absurd, mundane sound to notice in a moment that otherwise felt like the floor had opened beneath the entire table. Vanessa's mouth opened and closed once before any sound came out. That's not, she started, then stopped, glancing at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face in years, something raw and unguarded underneath the polish she usually kept so carefully maintained. Emily runs Carter Enterprises for over 2 years now, I said, speaking for the first time since my father had stood up. My voice came out steadier than I expected, and I watched something in her face falter further at the sound of it. But you were, she stopped again, visibly trying to reconcile the version of me she'd walked in the door believing in with whatever was now sitting across the table from her. You were staying with mom and dad. You were, I don't know, figuring things out. That's what everyone said. That's what I let everyone say, I told her. There's a difference. My mother reached over and rested a hand on my father's arm, and I watched something pass between them. Decades of a marriage that had clearly involved more quiet strategy than I'd ever given either of them credit for. My father didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on Vanessa and Mark, patient in the specific way he'd been patient all evening, like a man watching a door finally swing open exactly the way he'd known it would. Mark, who had gone very quiet throughout this exchange, finally spoke, his voice carrying a forced casualness that didn't match the tension visibly building across his shoulders. Okay, he said. That's great, Emily. Genuinely. I'm happy for you. I know you are, I said, and something in my tone must have carried more than the words themselves, because I watched his forced smile falter slightly at the edges. Vanessa was still working through the arithmetic of it, I could tell. The way her eyes moved between my father and me like she was searching for the moment this had actually happened, some door she'd missed while she was busy building a life 3 states away. This whole night, she said slowly, you knew we were coming. You knew exactly what you were going to tell us. I did, my father said simply. And you let us, she said, her voice climbing slightly. You let us walk in here and say those things to her, knowing I let you walk in here and be exactly who you already were, my father said, and for the first time all evening, there was something harder underneath his calm, not raised, never raised, but unmistakably firm. I didn't put words in either of your mouths. You did that yourselves the moment you crossed the threshold. The room stayed quiet after that, nobody quite ready to speak first. My mother refilled no one's glass. The pleasant, easy conversation of 20 minutes earlier felt like it belonged to an entirely different evening, one that had happened to different people in a different house. Which brings us, I said, breaking the silence myself because I understood, watching Mark's hands tighten almost imperceptibly around the stem of his wine glass, that we hadn't actually reached the hardest part of the night yet, to your consulting firm. Apex Global, I said, watching him carefully. That's what you're calling it, right? He didn't answer right away, and the pause told me everything I needed to confirm what 3 months of quiet due diligence had already casually suggested to me. You've been trying to secure a credit line for a while now, I continued. 5 million, if I remember the figure correctly. You told your investors the funding was moving through final approval this week. Mark's face had gone pale enough that I could see it even in the dim light of the dining room, and beside him, Vanessa had gone completely still, watching him with an expression that was rapidly shifting from confusion to something sharper. Mark, she said slowly, what is she talking about? You told me the business was doing well. You told me the investors were basically confirmed. They are confirmed, Mark said, though the words came out with far less conviction than he probably intended. The parent holdings group approved it. The final sign-off is supposed to happen this week. I told you that already, Vanessa. This is just the parent holdings group, I said, cutting through his explanation with a calm I hadn't fully anticipated feeling in this exact moment, is a subsidiary of Carter Enterprises. The room went very still. The underwriting file crossed my desk 2 weeks ago, I continued. I recognized your name immediately, obviously. I could have flagged it right then and killed the deal before it ever got this far. I didn't. Why not? Mark's voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper, and I could see his hands actually trembling now against the white tablecloth. I let the question sit for a moment before I answered it. Not for effect, but because I genuinely wanted to be precise about what I said next. The way I'd learned to be precise about everything that actually mattered. Because I wanted to see what you'd do with it, I said. And I wanted to be the one sitting at this table when you found out exactly whose signature was on the approval. Vanessa's face had drained of every trace of color by the time I finished speaking. She looked at Mark, then at the folder still sitting open on the table, then back at me, and I watched her do the math I'd been waiting 3 years for someone in that family to finally have to do. You knew, she said quietly. This whole time you knew and you let us walk in here. I let you walk in here and say whatever you were going to say, I said. What you said was your choice, not mine. Mark's hands were shaking openly now, no longer bothering to hide it. Emily, please. If that approval doesn't go through, we lose everything. The house, the business, all of it. I'm asking you. I'm begging you. We're still family. Family, I repeated, and something in the way I said the word made him flinch, like he'd expected it to land softer than it did. You want to know what I remember about family? I remember standing in a doorway 3 years ago watching the two of you decide, without a single moment of hesitation, that whatever I thought this word meant didn't matter to either of you at all. That's not fair, Mark said, though his voice had lost whatever conviction it started the sentence with. People make mistakes. People change. They do, I said. I did. I'm just not sure either of you have any idea what that actually looks like, because you're both still sitting at this table trying to talk your way into something you haven't earned. Vanessa, silent through most of this, finally spoke again, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. So that's it? You're just going to let everything collapse for us? I'm not doing anything to you, I said. I'm simply choosing not to stop something you built entirely on your own. We stopped being family the moment I walked into that bedroom 3 years ago, I said, and my voice didn't shake at all, which surprised me more than anything else that had happened all evening. You didn't come back tonight for an olive branch. You came back because you needed something, and you assumed I'd still be the same person who never noticed what either of you were capable of. Vanessa opened her mouth to say something, then closed it again. The practiced softness from earlier in the evening completely gone, replaced by something rawer and far less rehearsed. You asked me earlier if I was still single, I said, standing up from the table, looking down at both of them for the first time all night. The answer is yes, but unlike either of you, I don't need anyone else's name attached to mine to know exactly who I am. Nobody said anything for a long moment. My mother's hand had found my father's under the table, and my father simply sat there, watching the two people who had spent 3 years believing they'd destroyed me finally understand they hadn't. There was no triumph in his face, only the quiet, settled look of a man watching something come full circle exactly the way he'd expected it eventually would. I picked up the serving spoon from beside my plate, the same one I'd been holding when they first walked through the door, and set it down gently in the center of the table. Now, I said, does anyone still want seconds?